Hi, good morning. Thank you very much, Fasecolda, for this generous and warm hospitality and invitation, and all of you for being here with me. I have been asked to replace the minister who's a bit delayed on his way over here, so please be patient with me. I am going to talk about populism. It is something that worries us today, not only in Latin America, but all over the world. Populism for a time now is a viralized issue or universal. That's causing a lot of concern in many parts, in the US, in Europe, and in Latin America, and even in some countries in Asia. For the first time, populism is not a focalized phenomenon in a specific part of the world, especially Latin America, where during the 20th century was one of the areas that produced the greatest versions of populism, but it has become a universal issue. I am also going to talk about the origins, where it came from, why it is so difficult to eradicate, to finally focus on what we're most interested in, which is the Latin American context. And perhaps I can also say a few words about the specific case of Colombia looked at from abroad. But please be patient. I'm going to give you some background. But it is essential to understand why this is such a deep-rooted event, and we need to understand its roots and where it comes from, because I am asked a lot, and many other people who write about populism, when will populism disappear? What is the way to have populism dissipate once and for all? And the true answer to this question is never. Populism will never disappear. What we can aspire is to contain it, to marginate it. But more than that, I believe it would be very naive of us to intend. Why? Because it is a very deep-rooted tradition in our countries and the entire Western world. So I will tell you about the background first, its origins, and then we'll focus on the present. The origins of populism are not Latin American. It has its origin in the European countries, the German tradition, for instance, of the 19th century. Here, Germany, especially in the electoral field, rebelled against what had been the illustration, the century of light, the idea of modernity, and then they had the Industrial Revolution. All this caused much fear in the German intellectual world, which reacted against this with a defense of certain values that today we would call nationalist, but at the time had another denomination. The idea of the folk, the people, the Völkisch movement was a movement of reivindication, ethnic reivindication, national reivindication against modernity and against the excess of reason. And this happened in Germany, which was the first country, like the first symptoms, gave out the first symptoms of populism to the world. Next came a very interesting movement in Russia in the 19th century of the so-called Narodniks, a group of intellectuals who said Marx was wrong. The idea is not to reach socialism after passing through capitalism. No, let's take a leap to socialism directly, and let's have socialist countries doing it the only way possible in a country like Russia, which is through the fields, the peasants. Russia was very much peasants, and the idea was to agitate the peasants in order to install socialism much earlier than the more developed countries. Also in the US, at that same time, a populist movement arose. The United States had the doubtful honor of having given humanity or humankind the first populist party, which had that name, People's Party. It could also be called the Popular Party or the Populist Party. It also originated in the rural sector, a series of peasant co-ops that did not trust the world of finance and industry, generated a political movement which resulted in the People's Party. And it would exist today were it not for the Democrat Party, that of Jefferson, which we all know today, stole the flags in the late 19th century, nationalization of the railroads, inflation of the money. Money was an anchor, the monetary anchor at the time. Well, the People's Party and the background of the People's Party there said, no, we have to inflate the currency, just like many Latin American has been done in Latin America. So this has nothing to do with Latin America, all of this. But it would not be too late for Latin America to also be receptive to the ideas of populism. There are two large traditions that in Latin America invite to populism, that in a certain way call populism. One is utopia and one is myth. There isn't a populist in this world, anywhere in the world, but we know this very well and closely in Latin America, that has not proposed a utopia, which is an inexistent future, an impossible future, one we will never be able to reach. But the populist has the capacity of embedding in the mind of its people the idea that not only is this future reachable, but in addition, the only way to reach it is by taking a shortcut on the hand of this populist leader. This is the utopia. The myth is the contrary of this. It's a glorious past that never existed, but the populist with his incendiary speech can also create in the minds of these people a so-called reality to which one has to return. So the speech of populists, there's always a glorious past and a utopic future. With this tradition, utopia and myth, it also comes to us from the more advanced countries in the world. When this big clash of civilizations, this meeting of civilizations with the discovery of America, herein were installed, or these traditions in Latin America almost immediately. There was a large Western tradition of utopias, the Judaic-Christian of paradise. That's the greatest utopia ever made up by humanity, and is the core of the religion. We also had the subsequent utopias like the Renaissance, which were still very alive when Latin America began existing in the imagination of the Western world with the discovery of America. And Europe believed to have found in these lands the confirmation of its utopia to a certain extent. Then in Europe, there's other utopias, that of the socialist utopia of the 19th century. These socialists are very idealist, very utopic, etc., etc. So this starts declining in Europe, but it is reborn, especially in the 20th century in Latin America, where utopia becomes a core part of our political life. The same thing happens with the myth. The idea of an inexistent past, but a past that the public has to be convinced existed, is central to politics in Latin America. We find this great clash, a violent clash of Europe and America. Immediately, myth is installed. The idea that the West is contaminated, corrupted, has corrupted in turn these pristine republics, these originary republics later, not at the time, but that to a certain extent were like a reservoir of purity for mankind. None of this is true when you study the pre-Columbian civilizations. In them were also, in addition to great accomplishment and advances, a lot of barbarism. But the mythical idea was that, to a certain extent, Europe had corrupted the pristine lands and ideas of America. And this glorious past that never existed is going to become a core of our political life. So I believe it is very important to consider these two traditions when we talk about populism: the utopic tradition, the absolutely unattainable future, and the mythical past, the past that never existed, but that we're going to be convinced that it existed, because thanks to that conviction is that we're going to believe that that utopic future will be attainable. A phenomenon happens in Latin America, a very interesting one. In the 19th century, in all Latin American republics, is that the struggle between conservatives and liberals. But at a given time, liberalism splits in two, and this happened in the early 20th century. The liberals of the 19th century, who had defended the ideas that we all know, they had defended ideas that dealt with the American Revolution, in part with the French Revolution, produced a sort of subdivision, a movement contained within it that I would call the proto-populism, which is that of the first populist currents in Latin America, which are the ones that see the light in the early 20th century. There's many governments that can be rated as such. I can mention two or three: Irigoyen in Argentina, Valle and Ordóñez in Uruguay, Billinghurst in Peru in a certain way. These are proto-populists, not exactly populists. They're not Chavistas, but to a certain extent they are proto-populists. They come from a liberal origin, which is interesting. Liberalism, populism today are faced against each other in an intellectual and political struggle. But to a certain extent, then, proto-populism came, it was like a branch that broke off from liberalism. Why did this happen? There's many reasons that I don't want to dwell on, but it is important to understand the Latin American transit, of course, from the rural world to the urban world. The political Latin American world found some certain masses that needed to channel their energies and potentially constituted a wealth of voters. And it was an audience, a public that nobody was addressing at, sending a captivating message. And proto-populism found in these recent urban masses the perfect place to grow and flourish. Also in the 1930s, a country like Argentina, which has had great economic success, it used to be one of the 10 most developed countries in the world, attracted more than 6 million immigrants at the time from Europe. Since 1850-something, 1853 to be more exact, with the liberal constitution of the time, until 1925, 1926 or 27, when we start to see the appearance of populism, the initial stages. And then with the Great Depression in America, it is clear in Argentina, if you look at the legislation at the time, you see a very close relation between the economic effects of the Great Depression and the start of a new legislation and new regulations, which starts to be anticipatory of what will follow. And also, the great social inequalities, having a colonial legacy that had not been resolved by the 19th century. There was also a world of decision-making that was very small, very little connected to the large mass of population. The economic mass was in a very few hands. It was not an open, free economic world. It was a more oligarchic, to use populist words. And these opened the gates to the populist speech, which the liberals did not know how to confront in a timely manner. And for this reason, populist parties in my country, for instance, in Peru, the APRA moved in to hold a very important place in the low middle class and lower classes, which would later become important for the political voting results. In the 1930s, populism was two-faced. It had a liberal face on the political aspect. It fought for very noble causes, which were also liberal causes. They wanted to expand the political census, It was a very small world, it excluded people. They wanted to have a larger, a more participatory public space, more inclusive. But in economic terms, they were more collectivist than liberal. That's why I say that they were sort of perversion of liberalism, which had maintained the policies of freedom, but started contaminating the ideas of freedom with a level of collectivism, interventionism, and statism, which would continue into the next generations of populists. And then, almost as a natural result of all this, came the theories that we associate with populism in Latin America: nationalization, substitution of imports, protectionism, the followed by democratization in the 80s, etc. But this is also very important to understand that these phenomena did not fall from the sky overnight, that they have very deep roots in these lands, and for this reason, they're very difficult to eradicate. And to conclude with this background, I want to mention very quickly the key role that raw materials play in populism. Latin American populism would not be what it is without raw materials, which have an element that is not only economic, it has a utopic and mythic element as well. I told you about the utopic and mythic tradition. Well, in the speech of any populist, products of the ground, of the land, and the land itself are a point of confluence of that past that is made up and that future that's impossible, but that seem perfectly attainable and true in the populist speech. And raw materials have this dimension. For this reason, the great populists have gone down in history as people who did not make economic decisions, but a historic decision. Lázaro Cárdenas in Mexico in the 1930s, for instance. Carlos Andrés Pérez in his first version in the 1970s in Venezuela. Great nationalizers who have gone down in history are great patriots, because the idea of the natural resource or the raw materials as an agent of freedom of oppressed people is a very powerful idea to populists. For populism, as you all know, this captive vote is very important. The idea of voters. And the raw materials here are very important because they generate the input for this. It is calculated in $1 billion, the money that entered fiscal coffers in Venezuela during Chavism because of thanks to the oil. As you know, price of oil was at $8, and it spiked to 180 or 140, and imagine what that meant for Chavez. But these millions of dollars, which is what an average country produces in 5, 6, or 7 years, its entire economy, this is what entered the fiscal coffers of Chavism. Evidently, this political corruption was due to the fact that these resources were put in the hands of Mr. Chavez, where he had the capacity of buying those wills, those votes. Something similar happened in Argentina, not because of oil in this case, but the income from agriculture, also calculated at $1 trillion, or 1 billion Argentinian pesos. And this also explains why, or until the collapse of the economic model had a very deep popular roots. All this ended, and I believe this is a very interesting moment, because as this boom ended, and it's been several years since it ended, a new opportunity has arisen for Latin America, inasmuch as many of these populist governments have lost power. Some have disappeared, they've been eradicated, and others are weakened. But the big question is, what is going to happen afterwards? Because populism, as we will see later, as it can weaken considerably being in power during the bad times, it can also gain strength if through this utopic and mythical speech convinced citizens that the main responsibility of these bad periods are the responsibility of those who are holding office or those who are in power. One last comment about populism. Populism is not a political phenomenon in Latin America. I wish it were, because it would be more restricted and confined in certain sectors. It's a cultural phenomenon. I want to give you two quick examples to understand up to what point it is part of a culture. Almost all of the Latin American popular culture, even the one we like, the one that seduces us most, has an influence of populism. I don't know how many of you watch telenovelas, but I have I have researched so that I can speak with sufficient information. I do know some very good telenovelas, a very populist message. What do we find usually in a soap opera or telenovela? Where usually there's an inheritance because wealth is not created. It's an amount that's already there. And it's not only an inheritance, but there's a fight for the inheritance. And the populist approach, of course, is nothing else but a total zero. You cannot be prosperous. I cannot be prosperous at the same time. Prosperity can only exist if I have it at your expense or vice versa. This dispute is at the core of all or almost all telenovelas in Latin America. What is the vehicle of social or scaling up or going up? Mostly marriage of the girl that works at a house and marries the boss's son, or that social mobility depends on an interclass marriage. There cannot be a more populist idea. This is the bombarding that millions of Latin Americans receive every single day, generation after generation, sometimes very artistically, but that's the subliminal message that is being conveyed. Protest songs. Who hasn't sung a Latin American song of protest? We have all sung them or danced to them. However, the Latin American protest song, with one or another exception, is irresistible demagogy. It's a praise to populism. And I believe that because populism stole from liberalism in the 1930s, this great protest against the status quo, against the establishment. I told you earlier how liberalism is the greatest rival of conservatism in the 19th century, and we see how in the 20th century this branches off from liberalism towards populism. This is where the masses arose in Latin American politics. This happens in a very reduced space. It massifies, and that's where we see the birth of Latin American protest. And it is born by the hand of these populist leaders who have the intuition of understanding that there's something for their potential growth that's very important. So we see a phenomenon with a great historical tradition and also with great deep cultural roots. I talked about the relations between raw materials and populism. I'm not going to tell you something here that you don't know, but we need to remind us about this. Latin America had a great boom that was not a result of populism, but had to do with international markets. And look at this great drop in Latin American prices when commodity prices started dropping, especially in 2011. Look at this big drop as of 2011. There have been a great period of boom since 2003. In 2009, we saw a downturn and then a recovery in 2010. And after that, we see this collapse in commodity prices. Well, this boom between 60 and 70% from the boom. So for many countries, this was very significant. What is the social effect on this, the immediate and the potential? That which affects the middle class. If there is an important story to tell in Latin America of the last decade and a half, in Latin America, from 2000 till present, it is that of the growth, the emergence of the middle class. Latin America was, like we saw earlier, a world with a scarce middle class with very big inequalities. One of the effects the reform process, the more or less liberal reforms of the 1990s and others before that in other countries, was to release the potential of a large part of our population and facilitate the process of emergence of a middle class that did not exist until then. However, we call middle class something that's diverse and heterogeneous, and is sometimes a way of simplism, because within the middle class there is indeed a very broad arch that covers from people who are still very close to poverty line and could have crossed that border only temporarily to then recede, and then others who have passed on to have levels of life that separate them from the poverty lines and give them a sort of protection against adversities. It is very important to understand within this context, a context where commodities prices, even though they have risen a bit, are still depressed in certain areas, to understand why the vulnerable middle class is so important. If we were also exercising a certain simplism of dividing middle class between the vulnerable and the rather protected or safe, we could do it in these terms, to say that more or less 37%, almost 40% of the population, it's a large universe of Latin Americas, is within what one could call the vulnerable middle class. It subsists with between $4 and $10 a day, and those who are between $10 and $50, which is not a universe you can ignore, it's 28, 30%, become the more or less protected middle class. In the Latin American context, from 2011 onwards, indeed, the sector most attention is to be paid is that 40% of the vulnerable middle class population in terms of populism. Because if this extended more, if there were a recession in these countries, or if Latin America continued being paralyzed in terms of the performance of reforms, no significant reforms have been made in the recent years, one cannot discard that a significant percentage of this middle class would start paying attention once again to these siren calls of populism. Furthermore, in this middle class, there is an awareness that was inexistent before with respect to the level, the standards of living in more developed countries. Some of the effects of this revolution in communications is that it has placed at anyone's hand a very broad, intense level of information regarding how other people live. This has precipitated in many Latin American countries a very interesting social reaction. You might recall that in recent years in Brazil, Mexico, Chile, in many countries, the middle class went out in the streets, sometimes for education, in others for health, in others simply for transportation. That is, public services, utilities, that this middle class understood were well below their expectations. Into their pockets have entered certain resources with which in the past they couldn't even dream of. But these resources did not put at their reach those public services and utilities they understood corresponded to them and other countries in the world enjoyed. This was very important to mobilize the middle class in the streets, and I believe produced that rejection, that mass rejection of the population against corruption. Why do I raise this here? Because in the context of a middle class that almost in 40% of the population is still vulnerable, if in the coming years in Latin America we do not take certain steps, and if the international context does not help, evidently this vulnerable middle class that we see is already raised against its state, against its context, that has a constant claim, an urgent claim of its country, it will be very vulnerable, very receptive to the populist discourse, and I think this needs to be taken into account. Many times I have been asked whether there's a direct relation between commodities prices or the part of the cycle Latin America is crossing, and politics. For instance, one question is there more democracy, less democracies, more dictatorships or less dictatorships, more Chavistas or less Chavistas, according to commodities prices? Well, the good news is that there's no direct correlation. I give some examples here to give you an idea. On the high part of the cycle, moments in the 20th century where Latin America was on the high part, good international prices of commodities, hydrocarbons, agriculture, etc. There's been periods where this facilitated the consolidation of democracy. In the 1940s, the 1990s, but we also seen the opposite, periods where this, paradoxically, it facilitated the anti-democratic process. You can call it dictatorship or the emergence of guerrilla groups, and this happened in the late 1940s, the 70s, and of course in the first decade of this millennium, which is the example we have most at hand. And contrary, on the lower part of the cycle, and similarly, in the lower part of the cycle, we also see a similar case. When the high prices of commodities consolidated, democracies. This happened in the late 50s and the late 90s and late 80s and early 90s. This happened during the democratization of Latin America and the last decade from an economic standpoint. Look at how interesting. One would tend to think that that economic scenario would have facilitated the democratic weakness, but it did not happen like that. We were coming from military dictatorships, non-democratic regimes, and hence the 80s to a certain extent were the years of the pendulum towards democracy, which corresponded to the low part of the cycle. And the contrary, times when the low part of the cycle did facilitate the emergence of non-democratic governments in the 20s, the 60s, and also the late 90s, specifically the case of Venezuela. But there's less good news that makes me remind you this idea of the vulnerable middle class mobilized in claims and complaints of a social nature, and the international price context still depressed prices for many of our commodities. And there does tend to be, and I'm not being a fatalist, there's of course exceptions and history is not written. We make it every day with our imagination and will. But there does tend to be in Latin America a relation between the low part of the cycle, which to a certain extent we're still crossing, although less than 3 or 4 years ago, and populism. Look at what happened in the second half of the 40s, and Peronismo is a clear example of this in Argentina. And what happened in, well, all these dates that I show here, the 1920s, the 40s, the 50s, the 80s, the late 1990s decade, and then from 2011 onwards, and there's a big question mark there. We are still in a relatively low part of the cycle, and the big question is if this is going to help us marginalize these populists and consolidate liberal democracy as a system, market economy as an economic model, and globalization, or will these values tend to be eroded as social unhappiness and discontent and populism profit of these circumstances? I think the answer is not there yet, but perhaps this will be the most important thing for the coming years. What happens today in Latin America? Well, this is good news. This is a very optimistic message that I want to convey to you now. As we all know, in recent times, we've seen a weakness and eroding of populism in many parts because of the calamities they brought to their countries because of mistaken policies, and also because of an adverse international context that deepened the internal effects of said ill policies by so many countries in recent years. A crucial role was played in the installation of Latin American populism in this new millennium. 2 countries, Brazil and Venezuela. Brazil in its democratic version, but perhaps because of that especially perverse, I think it's abominable that a country like Brazil, which is the natural leader of our region, administration, the one who should have to be the paradigm against which we all compared, the country that should be at the forefront and sort of drag the rest of the continent into other worlds. It should be the Germany of what Germany is in Europe. It should have been, or it was during the years of Lula and Dilma, quite the opposite of this, but also a large facilitator of the non-democratic, the non-Brazilian version of Latin American populism of the countries of ALBA and especially Venezuela. And you in Colombia know it well because for many years, and this happened before the peace process even, both Brazil and Venezuela had tied, in certain cases direct, in others ideological, with the FARC group, and indeed did not help at all Colombians who so much claimed it for the rest of the world solidarity in its struggle against the narco-terrorist guerrilla. However, all this has changed in recent years and in a very fascinating way. The case of Argentina, I've just been in Buenos Aires. I was there presenting a book. It's very exciting. You know perfectly well Macri won the elections in late 2015. His first administration stage has been shy because of his own decision, and he acknowledges that in public because he wants to overcome this curse according to which non-Peronist governments do not succeed in Argentina. The last non-Peronist administration that survived its entire period in Argentina is from the 19th century. So Macri's obsession is, yes, I need to make reforms, I need to dismantle the populist inheritance and modernize Argentina, but I need to survive for this. If I don't survive as a government, these reforms are canceled as a possibility for the next year. But he's accomplished this and more. In fact, in a couple of days, legislative elections will take place in Argentina, elections that the alliance headed by Macri will win said elections. And not only will it win it, but it will also win in the province of Buenos Aires, which concentrates 40% of Argentina's vote, which is a historical feat. Because if the region with the greatest concentration of populism per square meter in Latin America is perhaps the Buenos Aires province, and there, in the coming days, Kirchnerism will be crushed. They will be crushed in the Buenos Aires capital, the province of Buenos Aires, in Córdoba, in Santa Fe, even in Santa Cruz, the state from where the Kirchner family comes from. So what's happening in Argentina is especially interesting. Another interesting phenomenon is also occurring in Brazil. It is more complex, with more dark clouds in the horizon, but we all know that since Dilma's fall in a constitutional process, because there's people abroad who have a very mistaken idea of what happened in Brazil, a process we can discuss from a political standpoint, that from a constitutional and political standpoint is defended. This opened the doors for a very different government. A government, despite all the accusations against this new president, we don't know if he's going to finish his term, but he made a decision that Brazil will thank him forever, to resign to the possibility of running again for election. If he had decided to run as candidate for the 2018, because he could have, because in this period he's only completing the period of his predecessor, and therefore he was enabled to present his name, there would have been a tragedy in Brazil. Not only would he have caused greater convulsion than there already exists, but he could not have done what he's doing now, which is starting a series of reforms, tax, in pensions. It's something that's key to Brazil because it captures a very important percentage of fiscal revenues and implies a future debt that's great for Brazil. He is doing for Brazil what Itamar Franco did after the decline of Collor de Mello. I don't know if you recall, this was many years ago. A president in Brazil was also fell because of corruption, and Itamar Franco was appointed to replace him, and he made a decision, thanks to his resignation to being candidate in the following elections, something he was entitled to. He was able to start some reforms, many of which had to do with Fernando Enrique Cardoso, who, before being president, people forget he was a minister of Itamar Franco, and thanks to him, inflation was stopped. And this laid the foundations for the subsequent government, which then made the reforms that had to be made by Cardoso himself. So Temer is doing something similar now. He's starting the reforms with the expectation that in the next election, the winner be a reasonable, sensible option that will continue with these reforms. If that happens, I think we're going to have in Brazil a renewed Brazil, one with hope, and assuming a national and international leadership that we all claim from it. This is going to be very important, but there's more. One also has to take into account what's falling in Ecuador. The case of Ecuador is especially interesting because President Correa there basically appointed directly a successor. A successor he believes he can fully control. A successor whose only role is going to be to reserve his space, hold his space so that he can return to power later and keep outside of power all the anti-populist powers. This took place in a challenged electoral debate. I don't know if there was fraud or not, but if there was fraud, if it wasn't, then the field wasn't level. It was very evident. The resources used to make the present president win put it at a disadvantage, the opposition leader. But the government officials win the election, and the new president receives such a poisoned legacy inheritance that he's forced to say it in public and justify himself before the population because he knows he will not be able to give results to Ecuadorians in a very brief time. Such is the seriousness of this inheritance, and this results in a struggle between the movement, the officialist alliance that today has become a very open fight between the president and the former president. And this has created a very interesting opportunity for the forces, anti-populist forces in speech in Ecuador. And in that ironic, unexpected way, even mysterious, Correa's successor, whom Correa believed was conditioned to extend his own populism, has resulted in being a sort of unexpected ally of anti-populists. We don't know what's going to happen in Ecuador, but that has truly weakened the populist front, the Latin American populist front. In Chile, another interesting case to consider. I also recently visited Chile, and there one can say without a doubt that Sebastián Piñera will return to office. He's going to win on the first time around with a very wide, by a very wide margin, and will win with a very short margin in the second round. And his rivals are populists. But Sebastián Piñera is collecting much of the discontent of the protest of citizens against a government that took a populist direction that was not expected. President Bachelet's first administration was very reasonable, basically preserving the reforms and improve upon them slightly, but she was unable to maintain the economic development that had placed Chile almost at the gates of development. $26,000 per capita is the base. Well, Chile is almost there, but she was unable to attain this. And what she collected belief in was the desire from the people to reform and revise, but especially reform, but backwards, the inherited model. She started a series of reforms in taxes, in fiscal, and in education, which was very controversial, especially, and in labor reforms that created contaminating elements that were very populist. Contrary to other Latin American countries where the citizens react against populism only when the most perverse elements are installed, of said populism, for example, hyperinflation, like we see in Venezuela and happened in Argentina. In Chile, the middle class barely felt that the model was running the peril of deviating and reacted quickly and strongly. So Chile has seen a paralysis, but it's been a good paralysis in that it has stopped or put a halt to what was going to be a deviation of the model. And who knows if tomorrow, within electoral process, in these conditions, would it have consolidated the populist option? But the opposite happened. Citizens reacted. The middle class hindered progress of populism in Chile. And today, Sebastián Piñera is the beneficiary of this state of mind and is preparing for what will surely be his electoral victory. So we have this table in Latin America, or this picture in Latin America, where I think gives hope. Indeed, there are some dark clouds, and there's certain populism in Latin America, and we need to take them into account. The case of Venezuela probably causes discouragement. It's nothing more than a government that is repudiated by an 80% of the population. It is surely on its way out because it has consolidated a structure of power based on the military, which seems immovable immediately. So we see the remnants of populism in Latin America that has to be paid very close attention to. I think I'm running out of time or have run out of time. Let me talk about Colombia if you give me a couple of minutes. I'm not gonna say something that's really going to illustrate you. You know this much better than me. But let me tell you what I see, or some of us see from abroad, which is important. Colombia was a weird case from the point of view of many Latin America. You had previsibility, soundness, a more or less reasonable model for many decades when the rest of Latin America didn't have it. People wonder, how can Colombia continue growing during periods when the rest of Latin America is not growing? Well, because you had a set of institutional arrangements that facilitated growth. Even not being Colombia a developed country or having fully modern institutions, it had an advantage over the rest of Latin America. The political stability you have had since after Rojas Pinilla helped considerably, and there's very interesting data between the 70s and 90s. Colombia's growth is almost twice that of Mexico and Brazil. And in the 1980s, which is the last era of Latin America, almost zero growth, you have average growth of 3%. People envied what was happening in Colombia. Then the 90s was a more or less low period because there were many reforms, because the process of violence had reached dimensions that seriously affected political stability and the model. But even so, and under that context, in the years of the new millennium, a process of significant reforms and a democratic security policy emerged that, as you all know, was very successful and yielded many fruits. However, a paradox occurred. This is, at least this was seen from abroad, in that the Colombia's success was also the emergence of the danger that exists today. A danger that's not so large, but it has to be taken into account, this danger with FARC. To a certain extent, one can say that FARC would have never negotiated or participated in a true peace process had they not felt defeated in the military. Not defeated entirely, but from outside, from abroad, compared with other cases in the world, is that FARC only acted like they acted because they felt that upon us was a very heavy weight for their shoulders. From a military standpoint, that is, they were close to a final defeat. But being close to a final defeat doesn't mean a final defeat. So they entered into a peace process. I'm not going to issue a value opinion, but yes, to understand the root of this phenomenon. And that's an important price Colombia has to pay. Perhaps it is worthwhile paying. I'm saying this is not a value opinion, or value judgment. But when you have an anti-democratic enemy almost defeated, and it enters a process of negotiation and peace with that enemy, inevitably you're paying the price of evidently modifying that dynamic for a different one. A dynamic where this enemy has to be legitimated, has to be introduced in a democratic and political game, and will have to be given a space. And this democratic enemy will also do as many other violent groups have done in the world when they had to insert into civilian life a mutation, an ideological transformation, which is that of populism. FARC are going to introduce now, they are already introducing in the legitimate political system with civilian life, legal civilian Colombian life, certain elements of populism that are much higher than what existed in the past. And this is something that Colombians are going to need to know how to react to. This doesn't necessarily imply in the future the success of populism, not at all. But it means it's an adversary, not FARC themselves, but this populism FARC are introducing in a new dimension into Colombia's society and political system that requires a level of alert, of permanent movement, and political, intellectual, civic, and ideological combat. Fully concentrated and without rest, if you want in 5, 10, or 15 years to see yourselves once again in the hands of populism. It would take me too long to list all the risks that I see from a specific point of view, but there's like a core element that is common to all populism and is something that requires of much emphasis in permanent observation in Colombia, which is the institutional topic. If something characterizes populists is the erosion of democratic institutions, that is, the substitution of democratic and liberal institutions for another type of institution, which are the populist institutions. Evidently, in Colombia has occurred by requirement of the peace process itself, the need to modify part of the institutional and constitutional arrangement you had. It was absolutely inevitable. Not doing it hindered the possibility of peace, a peace process. So Colombia made the decision of undergoing the peace process, paying that price, which I repeat was inevitable, if the goal one had was what the authorities had in mind at the time. So this implies modifying the constitution, also that you have the populist entity itself, to a certain extent verifying the implementation of some agreements. It also means that now they can intensify something they have been doing from outside the system, which was penetrating the institutions, especially in the jurisdictional and fiscal and judge systems, in a paralyzing and frustrating way for Colombian democracy. And then new elements that are going to play a very important role, which is that of communities. This has already happened in other parts, and they end up playing a central part or a core. They're going to be the playfield, the battlefield for this, because if the populism can penetrate and insert itself in these, it can benefit from a biased electoral system in favor of said communities, something which can be inevitable. But I also want to alert, raise an alarm against this, and evidently could also be camouflaged behind the movement of social protest that will be very legitimated by this peace process. And to conclude, if there are elements today in Colombian politics that from outside one could say that sooner or later will encourage the arisal of a critical populist mass, I would say, is the corruption, something one did not associate with Colombia to the extent one did with other countries. The weakness of the parties, Colombia until shortly was seen as one of the exceptions where political parties had greater solvency, greater soundness. Today, at least from the outside, one sees a process of erosion of the strength of political parties in general, something that equals Colombia with other countries in the region. This is also perfect place for the arising of populism. Also, the weakening of the rule of law, given the processes that have taken place when you introduce as a legitimate idea the modification of the rule of law with a greater objective in mind, this can be misinterpreted, misunderstood, and manipulated, because this means populism wants to enter the Colombian system. And evidently also the fact that economic growth in Colombia is not what it used to be. The international context, of course, doesn't help at all. A country that exports oil, gold, coal, and flowers, where there's an international context that is not the best. It is not the one that existed a few years ago. And I understand that oil reserves are relatively scarce today, compared with those of a few years back. All these elements, I'm not saying will fatally lead to populism. There's countries where there's no populist risk today that have similar conditions. But I'm saying that where populism emerges with a critical mass capable of modifying the system or winning elections, these elements tend to be present. So if I were a Colombian and I lived in Colombia, I would be concerned with trying to modify that context, to try to strengthen the parties, to try to punish corruption, as is being done, by the way, admirably in Brazil, of strengthening the rule of law, even though knowing a price had to be paid for peace, strengthen that rule of law. And of course, again, making economic reforms for Colombia to grow at rates of 4, 5, or 6% instead of 1 and 2%. If Colombia, and with this I'll finish, focuses on attacking these fronts simultaneously, I have no doubt that in a few years you will be able to defeat populism and reduce it to the margins of political and social life. If you don't, I'm afraid the dynamic can push Colombia into the opposite direction. So, well, once again, I want to thank you for the invitation and the hospitality, and I want to close with a message of admiration for Colombia, optimism for Colombia. These words are just a warning for Colombia, and my praise for Colombia to continue showing Latin America what it has positively shown the other countries in Latin America for many years. Thank you very much.